Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jack Ballantyne. I would like to welcome members of the DNA Subcommittee, New York State DNA Subcommittee today, and we have a number of guests sitting in the auditorium. So this, I would like to formally then open this meeting of the New York State DNA Subcommittee. And for the record, it should be noted that we have 4 members of the committee in attendance, which means we have a quorum for voting purposes. And these members are Drs. Carmody, Drs. Hirsch, Drs. Chakraborty, and myself, Ballantyne. Okay. So the first item on the agenda would be review by the committee and approval of the draft meeting agenda that we have. So the committee members have this draft agenda in front of them. I would like so what we have to do is approve this meeting agenda, unless there's.
I move it to be approved.
Second. Discussion. All those in favour of proceeding as described in the draft, say aye.
Aye.
All 4 say aye. Okay, so the first next item is the review of the last the draft minutes from the last meeting, November 13th, 2009. That is our previous meeting, so we have to review and approve these minutes. So the committee was given the draft minutes prior to the meeting, but I'll allow the committee a few moments to further review this if necessary.
So moved.
I'll second.
Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favour of accepting the minutes as the draft minutes as provided to us, say aye.
Aye.
All 4 members vote to accept the draft minutes. Okay, the next item is it's old business, and this refers to the partial match policy and a request for a binding recommendation letter to the Commission. So Gina, would you give us a background to this?
Sure. As you know, you had formed an ad hoc committee to study this issue, made some recommendations to the Commission. At its December meeting, the Commission voted to approve changes to the regulations and implementation plan to allow the state to proceed with the partial match policy. You had sent the Commission a recommendation letter in order for them to decide to do that. However, in order to properly amend the regulations, there needs to be a binding recommendation from this subcommittee to the Commission. So we're asking for that binding recommendation letter.
So there's a request for us. We've already written to the Commission saying that we approve of these the proposed regulations and implementation plan. So now they want us to give a formal binding recommendation. That's the next step in this. So basically, we're being asked to make a binding recommendation to the Commission to approve the proposed regulations and implementation plan.
I move we change the previously sent letter from polite to binding.
Actually, I mean, since we have a document that we approved before, is there any operational difficulty to call it a binding recommendation?
I think that's all it is a cosmetic designation of what we sent them before. I haven't heard any criticism of what we sent them.
The Commission approved this plan by a majority vote. So
why don't you simply change the title and call it a binding recommendation?
Well, that's what we're doing. Basically, that's what we're doing. That's what we're being asked to do now.
So technically,
yes.
I so move.
Second it. Any further discussion?
No, I mean, I would agree fully that it's just a cosmetic change.
Yes.
Not sure in my own mind what the subtle difference is, but whether if you don't adhere to this, you're somehow penalized. Would that be? I don't know.
If you don't adhere to, well, then the regulations wouldn't be properly promulgated because there is no binding recommendation letter from this subcommittee to the Commission, which is required pursuant to the statute.
Even though the Commission now has approved.
Correct.
And gone ahead.
Yes.
They still would like the support from us to.
Well, the statute requires that.
The statute. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's called legal handwork.
Legal,
We are not responsible.
legal
We are
window dressing,
responsible.
is that what they call it?
So the motion then on the table is basically that the subcommittee makes a binding recommendation to the Commission to approve the proposed regulations and implementation plan in relation to this partial match policy. So all those in favour of making that binding recommendation, say aye.
Aye.
So all four committee members in attendance voted to make the binding recommendation. Okay, thank you. So we come to the new business, and we have several presentations this morning relating to the statistical approaches to DNA evidence. And the first presentation we have is from OCME, New York City OCME, and we have Dr. Mitchell, Adele Mitchell, who's going to present her data on the likelihood ratio statistics that they've been working on for some time now at OCME. Adele?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. We are partway through our validation of this analytical method, and so I'll present what we have and what our plan is for the completion of the validation, and try to get some feedback from you so that we can better prepare ourselves for the next meeting at which we plan to have completed the validation. So, I bet I can do this easier. Okay. All right, so currently when we have an evidence sample that is a mixture of DNA from at least two people, what we try to do is deconvolute it or reduce a major contributor to the mixture. And sometimes we can do that. And if so, we can compute a random match probability, and everyone's happy, everything's fine. Often, though, we can't deduce a mixture, especially if it seems to be 2 or 3 people, or if they're about equal contributions, we can't pull out a major contributor. So in this case, this kind of a profile is only useful if we have a comparison sample, for example, from a suspect. We can compute a probability of inclusion, which is what we currently do, and what we have in development is a likelihood ratio method. So just quickly, the probability of inclusion is nice because it's very simple. You can do it with a pen and paper. The results are intuitive. It's very easy to explain to a jury. And we don't have to make any assumptions about the number of contributors to the sample. However, it can be very conservative, and it doesn't make use of all available information, especially if we have some samples from assumed contributors, such as a victim sample. Also, we can't use it if any of our comparison profile, for example, our suspect profile's alleles do not appear in the mixture, or are not labeled in the mixture. So instead, what we'd like to do is implement a likelihood ratio approach. So likelihood ratio quickly is a ratio of two probabilities: the probability of the evidence profile under one hypothesis over the probability of the evidence profile under another mutually exclusive hypothesis. So normally in a forensic situation, we're talking about a prosecutor's hypothesis and a defense hypothesis. And the data in this situation are the alleles that are labeled in the evidence profile. Likelihood ratio has some advantages. It's very flexible as far as specification of the hypotheses. It uses more of the available information than a probability of inclusion. It often gives a better estimate of the weight of evidence than the probability of inclusion. And we can model things such as dropout or drop-in. Disadvantages: it is a little more difficult to calculate. The calculations are not hard, they're just tedious, so you can't do it by hand very easily. And it's less intuitive than the probability of inclusion, so it's a little bit harder to explain to a jury. So one of the main reasons that we're moving toward this is this third situation here. So if we have a non-deducible mixture, if all of our suspects' alleles are labeled, then we can calculate a probability of inclusion or a likelihood ratio using methods that are already in use. If several of our suspects' alleles are not labeled or are not visible, then we can exclude our suspect, and we don't need to calculate any statistics in that situation. This third situation is the one that's a problem. Let's say we have a profile where maybe we see all of our suspect's alleles, but one of them is not labeled. It's below the threshold where we would call it. Or for our low template testing, an allele may not be visible at all. And in that situation, we wouldn't be ready to exclude the suspect, but we can't calculate a probability of inclusion because they're not technically included. So what we're going for here is a statistical method that will let us put a weight on this situation so that we can present the evidence and also give a weight to that. So there are different ways to handle this cannot be excluded situation. One approach is to calculate a probability of inclusion, but then if any of the suspects, I'm going to use suspect even though I know it's not always the comparison that we're interested in making in a case, but just for simplicity. So we could do the calculation, but then if any of our suspects' alleles are unlabeled or missing, then we wouldn't report it with respect to that suspect. A second option would be to, before looking at a suspect profile, determine which loci we're not real confident in. Identify loci where there may have been dropout and decide that we don't want to use those before, of course, looking at the suspect profile. Another option might be to decide which alleles to include in a probability of inclusion before looking at the suspect profile. Or the final option here would be to include dropout parameters in the likelihood ratio. And that's what we're doing. And probably the main reason for this is that we've found that we're not very good at determining which loci may have had dropout. So how would we do that? There are different ways that people have suggested to look at a profile and say that there may have been dropout at a locus. So it might be something where if you have an allele that does not reach a certain peak height, maybe it's above the threshold where you label the allele, but it's not high enough that you're super confident that it doesn't have a partner that dropped out. That might be an indication that there's dropout at that locus. That might be a stochastic threshold situation. Or another way might be if we have some peaks that are unlabeled, so they're below the threshold. We see them, but they're not labeled. That might indicate that there might be some dropout. The problem is, I think I showed this example last time. The problem is that we see that a lot, especially with touched items. So here's an example. This is a mixture that had a template DNA amount of 510 picograms, and so just one lane here with 4 loci. And if we wanted to identify loci that may have had dropout because they have peaks below the threshold where we would call the allele, for us that's 75 RFU, 3 of our 4 loci actually have peaks that are below 75. So if we were to use this method to decide which loci we don't trust, we would throw out 3 of the 4 loci here. We don't like that. Another option might be to use a stochastic threshold, which we don't use in our lab, but some labs do, and one possible stochastic threshold that's thrown around is 150 RFU. So again, if we identified loci that had alleles that are above the 75 RFU threshold but below 150, that's actually all of our loci here. So we might, if we used an approach like this, we might not trust any of our loci. And so we don't like that option either. So we have developed a likelihood ratio where we are incorporating dropout and drop-in parameters into the calculation. So this way we don't need to drop loci at all. And we are using empirical data to estimate dropout and drop-in rates. So the dropout rates are a function of the amount of template DNA in a sample and the number of contributors to the sample, the ratio of contribution. I'll talk a little bit about that. We have sort of a rough estimate of the ratio of contributors. And we've estimated dropout rates for heterozygotes and for homozygotes. So for heterozygotes, you could lose one or both alleles. For homozygotes, you can just, either it's there or it's not. And our rates are locus specific. We find quite a bit of variability between loci and dropout rates. So we've modeled this after a method called locomotion, which was published a couple of years ago from the FSS. The software, however, was never released. So we're using that as a base, although we've made some changes to that. This is something that can be used with single source samples or with mixtures. We are looking a bit separately at our high and low template samples. So for us, a low template sample is something that would have 100 picograms of DNA or less per amplification. And we can consider data from 1, 2, or 3 amplifications. So our low template samples are amplified in triplicate, and our high template mixtures are amplified twice. Although if there's only one amplification, that can be used as well. And we're using these empirically determined drop-in and drop-out rates. We've also included a module for degradation. I'll show you how we're looking at that. Degradation disproportionately affects certain loci, and so we're incorporating that into the calculation. So this is not an expert system. We use the allele calls that are made through the Applied Biosystems software. So currently that's GeneScan and Genotyper, although we have validated GeneMapper and we're moving toward that. So we take those calls. The program takes just the allele calls, and we're using our standard detection threshold of 75 RFU. We also have a general 10% filter, so if there's a peak at a locus that is, say, 1,000 RFUs, anything under 100 RFUs is unlabeled. And we have locus-specific stutter filters as well. So we're using the same filters that we use currently.
Dale, could you just rationalize a bit further why this 10% filter? Because obviously a mixture, there could be a mixture present in less than 1 to 10, or it could be 1 to 10 ratio.
Right.
So that mixture is going to be present, there's 1 in 10. So just I know you use this filter, but maybe it would be useful to just maybe rationalize
it's
why that filter
probably
is
something
used.
that we should explore further with this program, because we are now allowing for dropout. But I actually wasn't part of OCME when it was implemented, but I believe that it is because that would be such a minor contributor that we would be expecting that there would be dropout from that contributor. So it is kind of a way of eliminating a very low-level contributor to the mixture. Is that a good explanation of that? Okay. But yes, it is something that I like to play with, because when we're allowing for dropout, it may not be necessary to do that. Thanks. So presently, we have several sets of prosecutor and defense hypotheses that we are working with. So we have a single contributor where we're doing a test contributor versus an unknown contributor. So that would be like suspect versus unknown. For 2 contributors, it's possible to have a suspect and a victim versus a victim and an unknown, or something like that. Or you may not have a victim sample, so in a situation like this, we might just have our suspect and an unknown contributor compared to 2 unknown contributors. With 3 contributors, we have more options, because we could have 2 unknowns, or a known and an unknown, or 2 knowns along with the suspect, depending on what other samples were received in the case. And the number of contributors does not have to be the same in the numerator and the denominator. We have an option for 2 versus 3 contributors. And we're also working with 4 contributors, although we haven't completed the dropout rates for that yet, and we haven't started testing those. But there are then even more possibilities, because you could have 1, 2, or 3 known contributors along with your suspect. So the options for the program, for single source samples, we've looked at template DNA quantities from 6.25 picograms up to 500 picograms. If we had a sample that had less than 6.25 picograms, we don't go below 5 picograms in a single amplification, but that we would use the 6.25 picogram rates. we can look at a sample that has no degradation, or no indications of degradation, or some moderate degradation, or some severe degradation. For mixtures, we've looked at template quantities from 25 to 500 picograms. And again, if we had something below 25, we would use the 25 picogram rates. We've completed the dropout and drop-in estimates for 2 or 3 contributor mixtures. 4 contributors is in progress. And we separate our mixtures by whether they're deducible or non-deducible. So we ask, can we pull a major contributor out of this or not? And that's how we decide on which mixture ratio to use in the calculation. And we're working on a degradation module now for mixtures.
So Adele, with
Yes.
the low template samples, though, you'll be using more cycles, PCR cycles?
Yes.
Okay, so does that take into account, I mean, you're
It
going to take
does,
that into account?
right. So we treated these samples for the empirical estimations the same way that we would treat a casework sample of that quantity. So samples that are 100 picograms or less in an amplification went through the low template protocol, which is 31 cycles. And samples above 100 picograms went through the high template, which is 28 cycles. And the same injection parameters that we would use for casework cycles.
Do you sometimes run samples where you're not able, where you get like zero quantity?
We don't.
You don't do that at all?
No, we don't. So we use sort of a homebrew quantitation assay that's quite accurate, and so we have found that if we get a zero quant on that, we don't get a profile. So we don't go below a quantity of 1 picogram per microliter, because we want at least 5 picograms in our application.
Yeah, they're using the Alu, the Buell,
Right, the Nicholas and Buell
Alu,
method.
not the commercial kit,
Okay.
but the Alu system.
Because I have heard of other labs where they claim that they can get a zero quant and still get a result.
So, yeah, we found that our quantitation assay is accurate enough that we don't.
That you don't bother with.
If we don't get a quant, we don't go through. So as I mentioned before, we look at mixtures and we decide whether the mixture is deducible or not. And so if we have a mixture that appears to be a 2-person mixture, we would look at it and say, can we pull out a major contributor? If so, we'll use the dropout rates. We'll assume that we're then interested in the minor contributor to that mixture, because if we can pull out the major contributor, we don't need to do a mixture analysis. We can treat that profile as single source. So if we can deduce a major contributor out, that would mean that we're interested in the minor contributor, and we use the dropout rates for the 4-to-1 mixtures, the minor contributor, the 4-to-1 mixtures in that situation. If we can't deduce it, then we assume we have a 1-to-1 mixture, which is a bit conservative probably, because we may not have a 1-to-1 mixture. We might, it might be a 2-to-1 or whatever. So we use the 1-to-1 rates to be a little bit conservative. With a 3-person mixture, again, we look at it and decide if we can pull out a major contributor. If so, we use the dropout rates that we got from our 5-to-1-to-1 test mixtures. So again, we're assuming that we're after one of the minor contributors if we could pull out the major. If we can't, then we use the 1-to-1-to-1 mixture ratio dropout rates. So we've estimated the dropout rates at discrete quantities here. For single source, they're listed here 6.25, 12.5, 25, etc., up to 500. But as you know, evidence samples don't come in those quants. And so if we get a quantity that's in between 2 of these values, the program interpolates between them to figure out what the dropout rate should be for that. We're doing a little bit more work right now for samples that are between 100 and 150, because 100 is treated as low template, so it goes through 31 cycles. Anything above 100 is treated as high template. So we're running 100 both through the low template and the high template protocols for this. So that if we have a sample that's 90, it's going to use the low template 100 value to interpolate the dropout rate for 90. If it's 110, it's going to use the high template 100 value to go between 100 and 150. Does that make sense? Okay. And for mixtures, same thing. The quantities there are the ones that we tested.
So you have estimate of dropout rates.
Yes.
I mean, do you have any ideas to what's this relationship with amplicon size?
Yes.
And interlocus variation?
Yep. Yeah, so I have some slides later that look at the dropout rate by amplicon size. And it's in the material that we sent. All the graphs from the end of this presentation are in that. There are some graphs in here that are not included in that, but I can get these slides to you.
Adele, the relationship between input, template quantity, and dropout, is it an exponential decay somewhat at the early stages? Is it or pseudo-exponential?
It may be if we did enough samples. It kind of bounces around right now, but it, yeah, so
because I've seen some that show a kind of, I saw it at a recent meeting.
We don't see anything very smooth.
No.
I guess.
It's not,
So-
the sounds like there's some zagging, but it decays.
But
Yes.
it's a,
Yeah.
yeah. All right, so we want to make sure that that we're using dropout rates that are lower than the actual dropout rates, because we want to be conservative. We don't want to just be assuming that anyone could be in there and drop out, or try to explain that a suspect sample fits an evidence sample by invoking a bunch of dropout. So we'll use in our final, whatever the final program values are, we're going to use dropout rates that are lower than our actual estimates. And we're playing with those right now. We don't know what exactly we'll end up using, possibly 1 to 2 standard deviations below the actual estimate. So those are quite low. And we'll also need to select a minimum dropout value for template quantities with dropout rate estimates of 0. So in some of our testing, we didn't see any dropout, but we have to give it some small probability of dropout, or we can't do the calculation. So we're playing with what that should be. Should it be 1%? Should it be 0.5%? That. And then for drop-in, we want to use a low estimate, even though we do have some loci that show more drop-in than others. So we're going to try to underestimate these all the time. For degraded samples, we see that some loci are disproportionately affected by dropout. And it has a lot to do with amplicon size, although it's not, I'll show you that it doesn't strictly follow that. So we have used a stratolinker to induce degradation in samples for different time periods, and we've settled on 30 seconds of UV light for a moderately degraded sample, and 60 seconds gives us a severely degraded sample. We found that we can, in an evidence sample, for single source so far, look at the ratio of the peak heights at the largest locus in each color to the smallest locus in each color. And the slope of that gives us an indication of how much degradation there is in the sample. So that's something that we can use to decide, is this sample degraded? And if so, is it moderately or severely degraded, to decide which of these to invoke. And currently, we're working on this with mixtures. So we want to know what happens if we have a mixture that's not one-to-one and our major component is degraded. So the alleles that look like they belong to the major contributor at one locus may actually then be the smaller alleles at a larger locus if that contributor has been degraded. So we're looking at that, what happens there. And if we can, question would be, when we're looking at an evidence sample that has 2 or more contributors, can we identify one that has one component that's degraded or not? And if so, can we treat that appropriately in the program, and that's still in progress. So we'll show you that next time.
Adele, so
Yes.
you're using ultraviolet UV
Uh-huh.
to degrade the DNA, as opposed to DNase treatment or shearing and all that. The only slight problem maybe is, obviously, UV does cause double-strand breaks, and that's what you're looking at. But it also may cause other lesions, like pyrimidine dimers, etc., that could affect PCR reaction, which is a separate effect to the degradation. So I would consider the possibility of trying some of the work also, just to be sure,
Sure, okay.
that it's not that some of the effects you're seeing are not caused by the fact that in that amplicon there's a high preponderance of CPDs or other pyrimidines that are adjacent to one another
Okay,
that could be causing the polymerase just not to pass.
sure, that's a good idea.
So I'm just
We'll do that.
you know, because we create degraded DNA all the time, and we're concerned with. We do use UV, but we're also concerned that it could cause a bias. That's all.
Okay, yeah,
That's
sure,
it.
sure, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
We'll do that. So here's what our dropout rates look like for single source samples. So in the material that we sent you, we broke down the dropout rate by single dropout of one allele from a heterozygote, or dropout of both alleles from a heterozygote, or dropout of a homozygote. Here I've sort of put them all together since there were so many graphs when I showed them all individually like that. So here is the fraction of alleles that are called or labeled for single source samples for DNA quantities from 500 picograms at the top to 6.25 picograms at the bottom. And these are the identifier loci along the bottom in identifier order. So you can see that there are some loci, for example D2, that shows more dropouts. We're calling fewer alleles at D2 in general than we are at D19, etc. So it somewhat goes in order of increasing amplicon size. So we're calling fewer alleles within the blue, and then we go back up a little bit, come down again for the green, back up and down, back up and down. So there is a trend.
Now, what's roughly the sample size this is based on? 100 or 1,000?
So there are different numbers for the different quants.
Just a rough idea.
Yeah, so I would say 100. What? Some of them are much higher, yeah. But in the mixtures we have more in the single source.
But these are alleles of all sizes for that locus.
Yes. So we did look at when we have a heterozygote and one allele has dropped out, is it more likely to be the larger allele? And we found that it's not. We found that that it's actually almost equal. We didn't break it down by look at situations where we have one very small allele and one very big allele, but that would be something interesting to look at. But in general, it doesn't. There's no tendency of one or the other allele to drop out more. So this corroborates what we've seen before, which is that with a 6 picogram sample, in general, we see about half of the profile. So for two...
Can I ask you another question? I mean, with the same data, have you tried to plot the following to see if, for a sample, locus D8 had dropout indication, is the dropout for D21 and others correlated or independent?
We haven't. That would be a good idea.
I think that's a very important thing, because one of the problems...
We're treating them as independent,
and
they may not be.
we can multiply likelihood ratios based on allele frequencies across loci. As soon as you bring these stuffs in, one immediate question would be, is the dropout rate independent across loci?
That's a great question. We'll look at that. So in two-person mixtures, here we only go down to 25 picograms because that's where we stopped. So these This is when we have a 4-to-1 mixture and we're looking at the dropout rate for the minor contributor. So the minor contributor up to the 25 picogram sample will be about the same amount of DNA as the 5 picogram sample, and we see a similar dropout here, that it's hovering around 50%. What we see less of is the trend based on amplicon size. And we also see, when there's allele sharing, of course, we see less dropout than we would in the single source samples. Our 100 picogram two-person mixtures, we had fewer of those, so that one tends to bounce around a lot more than the others.
So Adele, these are concocted samples?
Yes.
Or these, yeah.
Yes, these
okay,
are buccal
so you
swabs.
actually know the quantities.
Yep, buccal swabs, extracted quantity. We actually quanted them 9 times. And took the average of that to make sure that we had a good quant estimate, and then used that to make our mixtures.
And then, again, just roughly, how many different individuals, genotypes are you using here?
So here we're using, we had 2 sets of 10 individuals, and we did all the pairwise combinations of the 10 within each set.
Manager, coming back to your question, if they were correlated, you would expect all of these line graphs to be superimposed. You basically superimpose them on top of one another, right? Which they're not.
Sample individual by individual, or mixture by mixture, depending upon is the dropout event for locus 1 correlated with the dropout event of locus 2?
Right. But what I'm saying is that if there was 100% correlation, you would expect all of these line graphs to have the same exact pattern, right?
Not necessarily.
If they were correlated?
Not necessarily.
Because of different alleles?
The amplicon size,
Yeah.
distribution of alleles.
Yeah, it's actually a separate question that can't be answered by just displaying
Right.
the data that
Right.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to actually look at one particular genotype and see how that's behaving across loci.
Or look at dropout at D21, if there was or wasn't dropout at D8. See what, for example.
I do not know whether
Yeah.
you would need more number of replications or not often,
You
but
might,
that
yeah.
would be good to look at.
Yeah, I think you could just go back to the data they already have.
Yeah.
And it's just analyzing it then
Right.
profile by profile.
Yep, and there's lots of profiles. And then, so for the 1-to-1 two-person mixtures, of course, we see less dropout, so we've got more DNA from each person. So even for 100 picogram 1-to-1 mixture, we really see very little dropout. 50 picograms per person. Oops. Going too fast. The 3 persons, the 2 quantities, the 2 contributor ratios that we looked at were 5 to 1-to-1, and then 1 to 1-to-1. So these are interesting because the 3-person dropout rates, for example, if you look at 25 picograms, they're not really any different than the 2-person dropout rates probably because they're sharing more alleles, and so there's less evident dropout in these. And the 1-to-1-to-1s. And so, if you're interested in how much of this is actually one dropout of one allele from a heterozygote, or both alleles, or homozygous dropout, you can find all of those in graph and table form in the material that we sent before the meeting. So, as far as drop-in goes, we've generally found that there is a bit more drop-in with 31 cycles of amplification than 28. So with 28 cycles, what we call ID 28, This is samples that have greater than 100 picograms of template DNA in an amplification. We found about a 2%, an average of 2% drop-in per locus per amplification. The majority of these drop-in alleles were in the -4 stutter position of a true allele. So we don't separate stutter and other drop-in in the calculations that we do. If there's just an extra allele in our known samples, we call that a drop-in. We don't care what position it's in. For 31 cycles, we saw about 3.5% drop-in per locus for amplification, and again, most of the drop-in was in the -4 stutter position. So I'm going to guess that most of it is stutter, but
Can
we
you
don't
ask
know
me a
for sure.
question? I mean, this might be a very naive question. These data are for samples that had been collected in a controlled manner and immediately analyzed.
Yes.
Is there any empirical data as to whether the cycle difference creates an extra drop-in for samples whose origin we are unsure about? For example, when a police officer is collecting the buccal swab on the field, he or she may have touched the swab itself.
Right.
So is there an extraneous drop-in that is sort of accentuated by additional 2 cycles?
I don't know about the additional cycles, but it's something that we could look at. When we do testing with touched items, we do see more drop-in. If we clean the item and we know who touched it, we do see more drop-in even in that situation. I could look and see what's the difference if we're doing 28 and 31 cycles.
That might be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So, drop-in did vary a bit by locus. So, in the single source, 2-person and 3-person mixtures, we saw the same trend. This is the number of amplifications that we were looking at in each of these. 30 for the single source, 180 for the 2-person, and 144 for the 3-person. So we saw that there was more drop-in at D18 than at other loci, and as well as D19 and DWA. One thing at D19 is we found that the 15.2 allele stutters incredibly often. So if we have a 15.2 in our mixture, we very often see a 14.2 also. That's responsible for most of this. And I think all but one of these drop-in events for all of these was in the -4 stutter position. So it seems like those loci are stuttering more often than the others. I don't know if that's if other people have seen that. But we're using just a single drop-in rate for 28 cycles. We're not making it locus specific, since most of the loci are pretty similar.
So what rate is that? What rate?
2%. What we've used so far is 2% for 28 cycles, and then we've used 2% for 31 cycles, and we'll compare that to what we get when we use 3.5%. So here's the 31 cycles. So it's a little bit higher. There's 28. Here's 31. And again, the same trend. D19, DWA, D18 tend to give more of what appears to be studied than the other loci. So with degraded samples, we artificially degraded. We did a bunch of time points and settled on these as sort of moderately and severely degraded samples for 30 seconds and 60 seconds. And we compared the dropout rates for these different time points. And we also did a peak height ratio calculation for the last locus to the first locus in each color as a measure of the amount of degradation in the sample. So when we didn't do any degradation, this was a 150 picogram single source sample. We amplified it, I think, 15 times. We got no dropout anywhere. And then when we degraded it for 30 seconds, this is 18 amplifications, we started to see some dropout. So you can see that D18, D21, no dropout. We start to see dropout at D7 before we start to see it at CSF. In the green, start getting some dropout at D2, really not much before that. It'll drop in right here. Then in yellow, we're getting dropout at D18. If we go for 60 seconds, what we call severe degradation, we lose almost all of D7, but D8 and D21 are still completely there. D18 almost gone also. So what we're doing in the program is, if we identify a sample that looks to be moderately or severely degraded, we increase the dropout rates at these loci specifically, and don't touch the dropout rates at the loci that don't seem to be affected. D8, D21, D3, O, etc. And we don't use dropout rates that are, so this is probably a 90% dropout rate. We don't go that high. We always way underestimate the dropout rate, but we do bump it up a bit for moderate or severely degraded samples. And the way that we determine whether or not we have a sample that's degraded is, as I mentioned, by the peak height ratio for the largest to the smallest locus in each color. So these are all 25 picogram samples run in triplicate, and we've calculated in each color what the ratio of the peak heights. If it was heterozygous, we added the peak heights together. So this is saying that CSF was about 64% of D8, etc. And so if you look for the whole, if you average the 4, this is what we got here for each. So when we have a sample that's not degraded, we generally see these above 50%. This one is a little bit low, we don't know why. And when you do this in triplicate, here's what we got. So we've determined that for a non-degraded sample, this peak height ratio is generally 70% or so. It can be as low as 50% as an overall average. When we degrade for 30 seconds, we usually get something that is between about 20 and 50% when we do the average of the 3 replicates. Some of them are very low. Sometimes we don't get anything at all at that big locus. And then for 60 seconds, we generally get something that's less than 20%. So this is a way that we could look at a sample and estimate whether there's degradation going on in a single source sample. And we're still working on how to do this with a mixture. All right, so we are testing our program, and here's an example. It works extraordinarily well for single source samples, but those are not the hard ones. So this was a touched item. It was a cell phone. We had someone, one person touch it. This was hard to see. It's a 34 picogram, 34 picograms in each amplification. And I've circled loci where one allele dropped out. So we have 3 replicates. Here's our comparison profile, our suspect profile. Here this suspect is 11, 12. Here the 11 dropped out. Here the 12 dropped out. Here's the 1926. We lost the 19 one time. And we get likelihood ratios on the order of 10 to the 20 to 10 to the 25. So that's nice. We also ran a comparison against a population database that we have. So these are anonymous postmortem samples that we've used to estimate allele frequencies in different populations. And we treat each individual in this population database as the suspect one at a time. And we run the program, see what we get if we have the wrong person in there. So in this instance, all the likelihood ratios were less than 10 to the minus 45 when we had the wrong person in there. So that's great. We're getting incredible separation between the right person and the wrong person. for the single source sample. Here's another single source sample, a much smaller amount of DNA. This is 10 picograms. It was from a fingerprint. And so you can see that there are some loci where we didn't get a result. We didn't see any alleles at some of these loci. The only dropout that we had was, or the only allele that we don't see at all is this 12 at CFS. So this person is a 10-12. We see a 10 one time, we don't see a 12 at all. There are other loci where one of the two alleles dropped out in a replicate, but we do see all the alleles at least one time. So this would be something where we might say this person cannot be excluded, because we see all of their alleles but one, and I think that there are no alleles in this profile that could not be explained by that person. So here we get our likelihood ratios are lower, 10 to the 17th, 10 to the 19th, but still very strong. When we run this one with the population database, here I put the top 10 results. So the highest result here is 10 to the minus 16. So we still have incredibly good separation between the true contributor to the fingerprint and this population database. The whole database is about 550 individuals, I think. So, very quickly we're at 10 to the minus 25. So we've also done this with some two-person mixtures. So here's one where we had 40 picograms of DNA, and we're making a comparison of our suspect plus one unknown person compared to two unknown people. So we have a suspect profile here, and this looks like a two-person mixture. We see all of our suspects' alleles somewhere, at least once, except for this 18 here at D2. We don't see that at all. And so when we do this comparison, looking at suspect plus one unknown person versus two unknown people, we get likelihood ratios in the range of 10 to the 10. When we run this with our population database, the top 10 results, here we're starting to get some that are, we don't get any that are larger than one, but these are, in the range of 100 or so. So when we have a two-person mixture and we don't have a comparison sample, we're not getting as extreme separation between the true contributors and non-contributors. Although these are still, in the formulation of the likelihood ratio, these are still evidence against the person being a contributor. They're just not as...
So this is the denominator of your likelihood ratio, right?
No, this is the likelihood ratio.
This is the likelihood ratio?
For non-contributors.
Okay.
Yeah, so for the contributors, they were approximately that, and then for non-contributors, less than one. All right, so I think of all of the samples that we tested, this was the one that gave the highest values for the non-contributors. We tried to sort through and find one that was our least distinguishing, but still distinguishing.
Yeah, but if you took the likelihood ratio of your good candidate versus your next best candidate, the ratio of that is tremendously. That likelihood ratio of likelihood ratios is tremendous.
Yes.
There's no.
Yes.
I mean, 0.01.
Right.
It's against the 10 to the 11th for liver loss.
Right.
It's a big difference.
Yes. There's big separation between
Still a big
contributor and
separation.
non-contributor. Yeah. Here's the same evidence profile and the same suspect, but now I'm throwing in the other contributor, the other true contributor, as the victim. So here our comparison is the suspect and the victim compared to the victim and an unknown person. And so we get a better likelihood ratio here for this comparison because we're using that extra information that the victim provides. And we also get better separation between the true contributors and non-contributors. So here now our likelihood ratios are 10 to the minus 19, 10 to the minus 20. So in my mind, this is one of the best applications of this is when you have an assumed contributor to a sample. It can be incredibly discriminating between a true contributor and a non-contributor. Although it is also discriminating when you don't have that information. So.
Actually, there may be some complaint. This is good data, but one complaint could be as follows. These separation of the likelihoods are the absolute values of these likelihoods are to a large extent dependent on the frequency of the alleles which you unambiguously called. Okay? So these are being driven by that. But you can take any instance of your data and can you go back and show some anomalies? One before. Let's take this.
Okay.
Now, our question is, the suspect had allele 18 in D2. We don't see that in any of the 3 replicates of the evidence sample. So one legitimate question would be, what is the chance that a person would be excluded based on that locus and not on the others that we have seen?
Okay. Like this person?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that would be now dependent on the frequency of the allele that is ambiguous in terms of calling.
Right.
So not being affected by the other alleles. And that question can be analytically answered. I think that kind of will throw more sort of credence to your deduced inference.
Yes. That's a good
It's slightly different from the standard likelihood ratio, but in the same vein that we have seen call these alleles, fail to call these alleles. Should he really be a non-contributor? What is the chance of his being excluded based on that locus?
This locus, just like this person. Yeah.
But what would your LR be for that locus? So the actual LRs that you combine here, but for that locus, it must be very, very low.
There's actually not much information here, right? Because we don't see anything in these 2.
Yes, so what would it be in terms of her computation? What would it be?
There she is including a little dropout rate, right?
Right.
Yes. Of that locus.
Yes.
And that's built in the likelihood ratio computation.
Right. But I'm just wondering out of interest what that LR would be for that particular
I'm going to guess
locus.
it's going to be fairly close to 1 for that.
Right.
Because there's only one replicate that has any data, and there's drop out of 1 allele, 40 picograms. It's probably less than 1, but I don't know how much less than 1. But I could get some examples of that and show some locus by locus comparisons. That would be interesting. Yeah. So here's what we're doing. We have a bunch of mixtures from buccal swaps that we didn't use in our rate calculations. And so we can we'll test the program with mixtures of the same proportions that we did use, as well as what if we got the mixture ratio wrong. We're assuming that it's a 4-to-1 mixture. If we can deduce it, what if it's actually a 2-to-1 mixture? What happens? As well as different 3-person mixture ratios. What if we have 2 major contributors and a minor contributor? We would say that's non-deducible. How well do we do with that 3rd person? But more importantly, I realized that sometimes we're not going to get a high likelihood ratio for the real contributor because some of their alleles are missing. The most important question to me is, are we always excluding non-contributors? I want to make sure that we're not doing something that makes non-contributors look like they could be contributors. And so we're testing not only these buccal specimens, which are very clean, but touched items, some that have been cleaned before we touch them and some that haven't. And we're doing this with 1, 2, 3, or 4 people. So that's in progress, and we'll show you. The few examples that I showed you before were some of the touched items that we used, but we have plenty more. And for the 2, 3, and 4-person scenarios, there are a bunch of different ways that we run it. We run it with 1 known contributor, 2 knowns, 3 knowns, etc. So we look at all of the possible formulations of the likelihood ratio with our samples. So there will be lots and lots of runs of those, and then always comparing to the population database. Also, another question that we're interested in with the 4-person mixtures is, or even with the 3, how often does a 4-person mixture look like a 3-person mixture? Probably somewhat because of allele sharing and also some because of dropout. So like I mentioned, we're comparing this against our database of known profiles. What we want to do is develop distributions of null distributions for the likelihood ratio, and testing with deliberate mixtures where we have the right contributors and where we have the wrong contributors. So that is all I have for you today, unless you have more questions. This has been really helpful at helping us figure out what else to do in addition to the validation that we've planned. Is there any more?
So do you think
Questions or
that
ideas?
you'll, at the next meeting you'll want to give another update or try and finalise this?
We hope to have it finalized.
Yes.
I mean, if the next meeting is next month, no. But if it's
Yes, 6 months maybe,
in
yeah.
6 months, yes.
Okay. I noticed what you didn't go through today was some of the details of when you do your multiple replicate amplifications, how you combine, how you actually use that. And we have this.
I can
in
show
some
more.
of the
Yeah, I can
documentation.
show more specifics.
Because my question would be, how does that approach, the LR, how does that compare now to your current method?
Okay.
And what's the effect? What's the
Right. So when we
the
use our
effectiveness of the new method versus the old method
Okay.
in terms of accuracy and
We're finding
precision?
it correlates so
it
far.
does, yeah.
We're finding that if we said cannot be excluded in case working out, the likelihood ratio is giving us a number that we can keep that.
It's not usually a super high number, but it's usually not less than 1. So, but that is one thing that we want to do is to decide, to determine if the samples that we say cannot be excluded, what do they look like with the likelihood ratio, and can we, give a better weight to those? Right now, we lump together a lot of things that cannot be excluded, but they actually may be very different as far as the weight.
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Jill, just the future, if everything goes well, could you just sketch it out? I'm just looking at it from a legal point of view and challenges and the software itself and maybe access to other people. So what does the future of this project look like, and if everything goes pretty well?
For the record, this is Steve Hogan from the New York State Police. I wanted me to introduce.
Okay. Our hope is that we could make this available to other public labs. We are working with our legal department on copyright issues, but it seems like it shouldn't be a problem. One issue would be, because our dropout rates are specific to our lab and our protocols, there would have to be some way to tie in another lab's rates. And it may be that we end up using rates, because we're using, not the actual rates, but things that are quite a bit lower than that. It may be low enough that it's low enough for another lab too, and there's not much that needs to be done. But we would.
In a year from now, is your lab report going to look appreciably different, or is it just an acknowledgement that was used as part of it? You're going to report your conclusions and say in a verbal way, and then in addition to saying that the isotopes were extracted based upon this, that, and the other thing, and deduced using,
And then hopefully have a sheet like the one where we have the evidence profile and the suspect profile and the likelihood ratio. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have Dr. Perlin, who's going to part of a two-person show here from the New York State Police. We have Dr. Perlin first to talk about true allele casework developmental validation.
Thank you. George, can I ask you to...
I can do it.
Oh, thank you.
So to do that, sure, I can do that. I can do that. Sure.
Okay, so
This morning I'll be talking about developmental validation that we've been doing with the New York State Police, Barry Dusman and company, for 5 years or so. It's a long-standing study. And we'll be describing the basic methods briefly. You've got the materials, and as you can see, I'm not going to spend the usual day and a half on the course that I will go through. I'm going to try to summarize in about half an hour the methods, the validation approach, the results, and how it played out in court, and what the study looked like. Next slide. See, I'm glad you're doing it without. Okay. So, like Adele and most forensic scientists or scientists these days who work in preparing hypotheses, we use likelihood ratios. And I'll, let's move that. I fall through the screen.
Careful of the windows, Mark.
I'll tell you about that later. So the identification, in this talk I will be using no math, except maybe for a probability here or there. Okay, this is very difficult for me, but I'll be using no math. The identification hypothesis is, it used to, 20 years ago people would say the person's guilty. Nowadays it's more diplomatic to say an individual or reference contributed to the evidence. And that's the hypothesis that we have. And our question is, what's the data telling us about the hypothesis? Well, we care about the information gained. Before we look at the data, we have our belief about the hypothesis, based on whatever evidence, general knowledge we have, and so on. If you're a trier of fact, you may have it. If you're a scientist, you have your odds. And what the odds mean is that it's the probability of the hypothesis divided by the probability of the alternative. Did it, didn't do it. Contributed, didn't contribute it. What's the ratio of those two probabilities? You have your odds. Then, whatever they are, you look at the data and you go from before to after. And you move from your prior odds, which you had before, to what statisticians call a posterior odds afterwards. What are the odds of the suspect contributed hypothesis after you've looked at, in this case, the DNA data? Okay? And then there's a change. Maybe it's the wrong person and your belief has gone down tremendously by 20 orders of magnitude, or maybe it's gone up. And that ratio of the change of information, the change of your belief, based on the data, is independent of whatever your initial belief was. That's the beauty of likelihood ratios. No matter what you thought, the data will give you the same gain regardless of where you started. And so that information gain, as originally defined by Jack Good in 1950, is the likelihood ratio. There are many ways of computing likelihood ratios. Adele showed one of them. That's pretty popular in forensics, but there are about 20 ways of computing likelihood ratios. They're all mathematically equivalent. This is the definition. What did we learn from the data? That's objective, and that's what's presented in court. Okay, and as Adele was doing as well, sometimes when you talk about numbers like a trillion, it's easier to talk about 10 to the 12th and use the order of magnitude, the powers of 10, 12. So if you hear me saying 12, I'll usually mean 10 to the 12th, because those are units we can add together. If each locus gives you maybe 1 unit, you add together 13 loci, you get 10 to the 13th. 1 plus 1 plus 10 and so on. Okay? Next slide, please. What is a mixture? That's what the study is looking at. It's good to define. So we have maybe contributor A, contributor B, and we want to, in nature, these different DNA contributors have been added together. In blue, I'm representing 2 alleles from contributor A, and in orange, smaller amount, they're lower amount, right, of contributor B. We add them together. Actually, we don't. Nature adds them together. This is evidence. And after we do an amplification on them, we get data that indicates that there's more of one than of the other. In general, there's some random variation. Computers model that. So this is what mixture data looks like. You see it's a quantitative pattern. Within random variation, if you had a lot more of A coming in than B, generally you have taller allele peaks for A than for B. Okay, so that's mixture data. I'll be using that cartoon as we go. Thank you. What is mixture interpretation? Well, mixture interpretation is the same, whether a person's doing it, a machine's doing it, a computer's doing it, using felt tip pens, doesn't make any difference. Everybody does exactly the same thing. There's only one difference in the rules, and I'll describe what they are. The first thing you do is you objectively infer a genotype. Don't look at the suspect. How do you objectively infer a genotype? There's only one way of doing that's valid, using Bayes' theorem. That's the only way of doing it that you can defend. And that is you consider every possible allele pair. You have to consider everything. And then you compare the allele pair, the patterns that are produced from those alleles pairs against the data. And you apply a rule to ask how likely each of those comparisons are. Then after you've considered everything, you divide by the total, use Bayes' theorem, and you get your probability of belief in each allele pair. If the data are single source and obvious and completely clear, you put probability of 1 on one of the 100 allele pair possibilities, and 0 to everything else. Otherwise, like in a mixture, those probabilities are not 1. They're between 0 and 1. You're representing your uncertainty with probability, which again is been the standard in science for 100 years. That's what you use to represent uncertainty, is probability. And after you infer a genotype objectively, whether you're a person or a computer, you then make a comparison with a suspect or a database of suspects, like POTUS, never having seen it before. That's mixture interpretation. And in a few moments, I'll also describe a human review approach for comparison, so you'll see the same steps. So what's the only difference? In overview, obviously there are thousands of details we could go into. I'm not going to be giving you detailed mathematical models of stutter, degraded DNA, relative amplification. You can ask me about it, but I'm not going to put that on slides. The difference is the rule, the likelihood function, when you make the comparison. The quantitative rule, which is universal in quantitative science, is instead of writing down equations, which George and Ranajit might like, but other people might not appreciate to the same extent, I'm just going to summarize it in 4 beats as better fits, more likely it. That's the math. You can write down a lot of equations for it, but that's all it's saying. What it says is if I have 2 big peaks, 2 little peaks, I'm trying out all possibilities, putting alleles all over the place, different heights, different amounts, different uncertainties, that if that's the data, too high, too low, and I get a wonderful fit, that has a high likelihood. Better fits, more likely it. If, on the other hand, I have 4 peaks, too high, too low, and I try to fit, I say, well, no, that allele occurred twice because the blue contributor has those 2, the orange contributor has a new one, but one of the old ones, and I don't account for the 4th allele peak, and I don't really fully explain how tall that peak is, that fit's not as good. And because quantitatively you see that it's not matched. So if you use your hands, if you want to show this to your kids, that this is the data, right? This is a pattern that's predicted and it fits very well, has a high likelihood. If it doesn't fit at all, 0. Basically probably 0 in the end, mathematically. If it's sort of in between, well, it's sort of in between. And so this might have a lower likelihood. After you've considered every possibility, use Bayes' theorem, you combine the stuff together. I've left out the other 100 things on this list because the probabilities are too low. And some have higher probability, some have lower. That's quantitative inference. That's the first step. That's how you infer a genotype. Then now you have to make a comparison. How do you make a comparison? One of the 20 ways of writing down the likelihood ratio formula, which is easiest to explain to juries and to lay people, but it's mathematically equivalent, when there's a definite suspect that you're comparing to, is at that locus you look at the suspect's allele pair and you say, at that allele pair, what was my belief in before I ever looked at the data of what that allele pair would be? Well, if you're a geneticist or a forensic scientist, it's the general population. You haven't done any experiments beyond your allele counts. So what's the rarity? What's the probability of seeing that particular allele pair in the population? That's my prior belief, before I saw the data. Now I've analyzed the STR data. They say, well, on a computer, considering thousands of variables, let it run for an hour, or by eye. And now you have the probability of that allele pair after you've seen the data. that ratio is one of the 20 ways of writing down the information gain, the likelihood ratio of what you learned by looking at the data. And you'll see some pictures of this later on. It's actually quite easy to explain. I started off with a population probability, maybe 5%. I looked at the data, now I believe 50%. I have an information gain of 50 divided by 5, 10. That's my likelihood ratio at that locus. Log of 1. Okay? Make sense? Just nod your heads just occasionally. Good. I know it's a long one. Now the other point here is the computer, by its audit trail and its methods, guarantees you objectivity. Because when it infers the evidence from the data, whether it's looking for 1 contributor or 6 contributors, it has never seen a suspect. It wasn't programmed in. For those of you who are old enough to remember Roger Rabbit, remember that let's see, the laughter, we can tell the ages of over and under 50. Jessica Rabbit has this fantastic line, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." Remember. The computer has to be objective. It can't ever look at the suspect because it's programmed that way. There's nothing else it can do. That's just the way it is. So first it infers, and then it compares. All right. So, not yet. Thanks. And so now we want to look at a validation study. And the basis of a validation study is going to be this universal metric in science and law and forensic science of the information gained. That's what law enforcement needs to know if you're police. That's what a prosecutor wants to know. That's what a defense attorney wants to know. What did you learn from looking at the data? If your likelihood ratio is 20, you're on the right track. 10 to the 20th. If it's 10 to the negative 20th, try somebody else. Okay? At least that's what the data is telling you. Maybe it's not the right data, but that's all the data can tell you. So now let's use likelihood ratio as a single number, or as statisticians prefer, the log of the likelihood ratio. The order of magnitude is 6, 9, 12 for a billion trillion, to look at some cases. So in this study, as Jamie Belrose will tell you about, we looked at 41 cases with hundreds of samples, and from all of those, as you can read in the encyclopedia that we distributed to you, of those meeting the criteria of being clear two-person mixtures, there were about 88 samples within 5 to 95% mixed proportions, and of those meeting those guidelines where there was a human review that we could make a comparison to, we had 16 cases. And you'll see why at the end. 8 happened to have not a victim known, 8 happened to have a victim known. And that's the data I'm going to show you next. Thank you, George. So what you're looking at are 8 cases, and here's the information, the log of the likelihood ratio. So here it's 10 to the 5th, 10 to the 10th, 10 to the 15th, and so on. And you see a range, but this is computer review, 2 unknown, not having, inferring. So what does the computer do? You put the data in, you tell it, please look for 2 unknown contributors. In all of these cases, we're just giving it 1 data sample. Using the laws of independence and statistics, of course, you can put more than 1 sample in with a product of likelihood ratios, of likelihood functions. I'm not going to talk about that today, but you can. But we try to make this as straightforward as possible. And then the computer plays with it for, cycles through all the variables, does hierarchical Bayesian Markov chain, whatever it does, it's described in the papers that you have. And then after an hour or so, it uploads its answer of a genotype. And then afterwards, it makes a comparison on the database of whatever suspects or population of suspects you asked to make a comparison with. And what you end up with, as one number amongst many, is the information. So here are the 8 information scores, and the average is 10 to the 13th, roughly 10 trillion. Okay, that's good, but people, as Jack asked Adele a few minutes ago, how about a comparison? Isn't that helpful in understanding? One of our goals in the study was to ensure that the information, the computer was always as good as a person. And if it was to any extent better, by how much? So we can quantify that using log likelihood ratio. And we will. Next slide. What's human review? Qualitative manual review is identical in every aspect, maybe not in protocol details, but every principle to computer review. It has to be, because it's valid. It's a valid way to proceed. The only difference, you try out every possibility, you make all the comparisons, is in the comparison rule. How do you compare the hypothesized pattern of every pattern you're considering against the data? Instead of doing it quantitatively, the rule is now qualitative. It uses an all or none logic instead of a number logic. It's the only difference. And so what happens here, if this is the data with too high and too low, the new rule is, for the likelihood, not better fits more likely it. The new rule is every pair gets equal share, which again is more memorable than writing out the math, unless you're a mathematician. But by a quick show of hands, I'll stick with it. Every pair gets equal share. So if there are 4 possible alleles, and and you have a pair of alleles that are included in those 4, it gets the same value. And if it's not included, it gets a value of 0. So the other 100 things that aren't here might have an allele that's outside of those 4. They get no likelihood at all. And what you see is that any of the 10 possibilities here, all on one or any pair, get the same amount. So whereas quantitatively this may not be as good, qualitatively it's included, so it gets equal weighting. That's the rule. That's what inclusion does. That's the mathematics behind it. All the listed allele pairs are assigned the same likelihood. And what's the result when you match? Well, if you have a good quantitative method, that would be on average giving higher probabilities to things that fit better, because you're being very fair, very socialistic, each according to his abilities, each according to his... They each get their same amount. In general, you get a lower probability, giving you lower information gain, because you're now comparing what you started with, the population probability, maybe 5%, instead of going up to 50% to get 50 over 5, which is a gain of 10. Maybe, I'm not going to put in all the priors and numbers because that's hard to explain, but if you had 10 equal possibilities, each would get maybe a 10%, hypothetically. Going from 5% to 10%, 10 over 5 is 2. So you get an information gain of 2. You still get an information gain. There's information there, but you get less. That's what happens, and you can measure it with a likelihood ratio, the information gain. Next slide. So what happened? In blue, again, on these 8 cases, you see the information from the computer. But now in orange, these are the reported match scores from the case folders. This is what you're seeing. These are obviously not the case identifiers. Everything's been anonymized and so on. Okay. Just in case you had any concerns. And so in orange, you see that we confirmed our belief that in every case, the computer got the same or more information. The blue bar is taller than the orange bar. And now we can also look at the average difference. Human review, if you do a lot of inclusion methods, CPI, you know is about 1 million, 10 million. That's what you tend to get. And that's what we got. 10 to the 7th, which is 10 million. That's what New York State got. The computer said to New York State, basically, you're right. You're doing a great job. Human review is always is fantastic here. If you reported a score, the computer agrees. That's what it is. It just gives you more information, which you could use or not use. The average information gain, the difference between the averages, is 10 to the 6th, or about 1 million. So you get about 1 million-fold information gain when you don't have a victim and you're comparing a 2 unknown problem by computer with CPI. Next slide, please. How reproducible is it? Well, these are statistical search programs. You have a Bayesian model, and you put in the data, and you run it for an hour or two. It samples, it looks through thousands of variables, tens of thousands of times each cycle, and when it's all done, it has a genotype. And then you can say what's the likelihood ratio. So if the answers were always identically equal, either you're looking at a trivial problem like a single source, or you're using Photoshop to create your slides. In the real world, you need some variation. That's what you get with statistical sampling. What is the variation? Well, in a 2 unknown case, as described in what you have, you can compute a within-group standard deviation. Formula's there. Number 2 2, if you want to look at it and think about it. Statisticians have known this forever. But you can think of it as if I look at the difference between the replications, what's that average difference? You can also do this with 3 reps, 4 reps, and so on. It's a way of, when you do a validation study, you want to assess efficacy and reproducibility. The last slide was efficacy, gain of about 1 million. This is reproducibility. The standard deviation is a few tenths of a log likelihood ratio unit, an information unit. If you think about the current population databases used giving you about a 1 likelihood, 1 log LR unit, it's reproducible within what we currently measure and what we do. Next slide.
Just on that, I would have expected if they were replicates that sometimes the second one would have been better.
I ordered them for display
purposes.
purposes.
Okay.
In fact, let me go further. Go back a slide. This is in the legends of the paper. You don't have to go back, but I'll say it on the next round. But no, they're ordered.
Okay.
Because it's easier to see and it's described.
Okay, I just love having the same color.
No,
Okay.
that's random.
All right, okay.
No, you're correct. Next slide. Okay, what if you have a victim? When would you have a victim? Well, in sexual assaults, homicides, you have a victim, and you can take the profile, and many laboratories compute, instead of a CPI, a CLR. CODIS Offstats will do that for you. And so now, for the computer's perspective, you give it the same data, you just ask a different question. In fact, with a computer, you can ask it as many questions as you want simultaneously. It goes off and solves them in parallel. You could say, use the victim, don't use the victim, look for 3 unknowns, look for 2 unknowns, whatever. And then you can look at all the results. You can also ask it from the very beginning to do everything in duplicate, if you're doing a study like this. Or even if you want to go to court, we like doing everything in duplicate. We like knowing what we have. So we can say it's reproducible. It's a computer. You don't need a person sitting there looking through it all over again. You can run it. It's a computer. So on each case, on an information scale, you get this information, which is an average of 10 to the 17th, not quite a quintillion, but good enough for government work. Next slide. Making a comparison with the CLR statistic that was reported relative to the most conservative ethnic population. That's how we did this. And this is what I'll tell you. So here we sorted, and it's described in the figures of the paper, from greatest to smallest. So if you like looking for the pattern, you can see that visually. We do it it just helps to see data sorted. The average information being here is 10 to the 4.5, which is about 50,000. So there's an improvement about 50,000-fold. And the computer is never giving an answer that's down there, -20. It's never even giving an answer over here, indeterminate. It's agreeing with, confirming, and giving more support to the human review. In this case, by a factor of 4.5 log units, about 50,000. Next slide. The reproducibility, well, here you're looking for 1 unknown, not 2 unknown. It's an easier problem. In fact, from the computer's perspective, it's looking for 1 unknown, and it's solving the mixture weight problem at every locus and for the templates that are involved. So it's not much harder, really, than a 1 unknown problem for the computer. And when you get down to a 5% mixture, maybe. And so the reproducibility is now measured in hundredths instead of tenths when you look at the standard deviation of the within-group standard deviation between the 2 computer ones. Okay? So for efficacy and reproducibility, we basically see on this data set, it's efficacious and it's reproducible, which is the whole point of a quantitative validation study based on statistics. Next slide. Let me sum up that comparison. Jack, I'm going to go just a little bit over, but not too much. So let's look at the 2 unknown and the 1 unknown, summarize it, discuss it, and then pretty much move on. With a 2 unknown, without the victim, we saw that the quantitative computer had a max score on average about 10 trillion. Log units 13, with tenths of an information unit reproducibility. Human qualitative review using everything the same except every pair has equal share as opposed to better fits, more likely it. The only conceptual difference in principle, qualitative versus quantitative, of 10 million on average, and that information gain averaged about 1 million per case. Okay, 10 to the 6th. What about when you have the victim, and that's available to you? Well, there you've got a bit more information. It's about 100 quadrillion, 10 to the 17th. Human review gets more information. It's about 50 trillion, 10 to the 12th. And again, you get an information gain of computer versus human, quantitative versus qualitative. The reason I say computer is that it's really hard for a person to look at 1,000 variables, do the calculations, and then repeat this 10,000 times. I mean, somebody might object. But the computers don't object. You just feed them electricity and some cooling, and they just keep going. Okay. Talk to them every now and then over a network, keep them happy. And that information gain was 10 to the 4.5 or 50,000. Now what's interesting, and we're going to see this in the case in 2 or 3 minutes, is the comparison of if you had a choice. Suppose, hypothetically, you have a homicide and you have a victim, and you're looking for one unknown. Some groups might choose to do an inclusion method. Other people might not. And you can compare with the computer. That comparison, which really is often what happens in practice when laboratories prefer to do inclusion, because as Adele said, it's easier to explain in court and there are some things that are nice about it. That information gain is 17 minus 7, or 10 to the 10th. So it's about a 10 billion fold on the sample set information. So one would expect that a computer using the victim looking for one unknown, on average, would do considerably better than inclusion. That's simply what the data show. Next slide. In summary, for the validation component, before we move on for the direct comparison, information gain, or likelihood ratio, is a universal measure for looking at what you got from the DNA interpretation. Now to do it, so think of it like this. I infer what I infer by many different methods, and then after I'm done, I have a fixed suspect or reference profile and a fixed population. Relative to those two being fixed, all of those comparisons are comparable of what you inferred, because each one will give you a number with respect to the same suspect and the same population. For efficacy, we see the computer does extract useful information. And there is some improvement, fortunately. I mean, it's fortunately that it extracts the same, but it's nice that it improves. It turns out to be as or more informative than human review. When there is a victim, reference available, it's about 50,000-fold. Without a victim, about 1 million-fold. It's reproducible within tenths or 100ths of a log unit, depending on what your question is. It's objective. I don't even need a show of hands. Some of you have heard about the sequential unmasking stuff. We heard it again last week at AFS. They have a new website, the books, the T-shirts are coming out soon, whatever it is. And so the issue with that is it makes this presumption, I think it's really a problem, makes this presumption that, forensic analysts are not objective, which isn't true, because that's just not what happens. But all this goes away. It's all nonsense with a computer. Because in parallel, you ask 50 questions of a case. You can't see the suspect. The computer doesn't know how to. It doesn't even know what the question means. Tell me, find something and I told you what to look for? I mean, it can't do it. It has to try everything, because that's what it's programmed to do. Like Jessica Rabbit, right? It has no choice. It just has to do it. So in parallel, it finds everything, whatever it is. And afterwards, it makes a comparison. It's guaranteed objective, which can be helpful if somebody's questioning you about that. It has no choice but to be objective. For productivity, we're going to go into this at the very end, but we'll see that the computer basically always gives a statistic, which is almost always usable. And laboratories, we'll see later on, I'll show you the data for that, give you an answer maybe 1 out of 3 times. And that has some implications, which we'll talk about. And this sort of science is useful whether you're doing scientific studies of the type that Adele or we or Barry and other groups do. It's useful for investigative purposes to try to find someone. It's also good as evidence when you're trying to implicate or exculpate. Next slide.
Before we do that, Mark, what would happen with your...
Why don't you back up one?
What would happen with your improvements, just ballpark? if the only data that you loaded was data from validated existing forensic thresholds, whether they be detection or stochastic. So we've got SWIFT doing what they're doing. And my question to you is, if we forced you, and I know that you wouldn't want to do this for reasons that we've talked about in different locations.
Mainly having to do with public safety, but yes.
I mean, I think it's an important issue. I don't want to hijack the conversation and all, but what happens if you use the existing thresholds or the ones that are being proposed to the number and the improvement?
Let me give you the answer. So, two answers to that. Should you choose to be more conservative in your human review, you would see an improved, the computer result would not change, because the computer models probability distributions of peak heights, as some of you know, because you've heard talks on that, and makes no use of such thresholds. So the computer improvement would get greater. But interestingly, in the standards that came out of the Swigdan Mixtures Committee, importantly, they put in a paragraph that said, if you're using probability computer modeling methods that do not involve stochastic thresholds, because they're accounting for it in a different scientific way, then you need to conduct validation studies, as we have done, and then that's perfectly legitimate. So the practical answer is that compared to where human review with stochastic thresholds is going, the computer will be getting an even more apparent information gain. Philosophically, all that's happening is that the data contain identification information. If you use the best possible likelihood function, which is a better fits more likely it, which other groups are, I'll talk about this in 5 minutes, many groups are using for research papers, science, and so on, then the goal of that is to extract objectively everything that's there. If you put other criteria on, certain thresholds, restrictions on thresholds, other ways of doing qualitative review with a less informative likelihood function, then you're artificially reducing the identification information that is present in the data. Is that a good answer?
It's one way of describing it.
Well, that's how a statistician would describe it. Okay. So, I don't want to repeat it, but the data has information in it. And if you do the sort of science that you'll find in thousands or tens of thousands of articles in scientific literature now, in Science, Nature, Journal of American Statistical Association, the standard scientific literature outside of forensics, the standard approach is to ask the question, how much information can I get from my drug study? How much information can I get from my gene chip? How can I maximize the return on investment as measured by information? That's all the computer is doing. And that's what I'm describing. And some of the details are in the papers that you have, which I've gently put into the appendices. So those of you who don't like looking at statistical modeling, some of you do, some of you don't, you don't have to read the appendices. Okay? Next slide. Oh. Can I go on, or do you want?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. How does this play out in court? Let me tell you about a case that I testified in last week. This is State of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Kevin Foley. In 2006, Blairsville dentist John Jelinek bled out in his home after being slashed by some unknown assailant. And Pennsylvania State Trooper Kevin Foley was University of Pittsburgh football fan, was charged with the crime. Kevin Foley happened to be the boyfriend of the estranged wife, who is a very interesting, complex story. You can read about it. Anyway, he was charged with a crime, and because it was a Pennsylvania trooper out of Greensburg, the analysis was done by the Quantico Lab, the FBI in Virginia, and when they came back with their inclusion statistic of 13,000, it was in the papers. I mean, Blairsville's an hour and a half east of Pittsburgh. It made it in the Pittsburgh papers. Why is it if the population of Pennsylvania is 13 million, who cares about a statistic of 13,000? And the only physical evidence, next slide, that was really linking the defendant, or the suspect, the defendant at that point, to the crime was DNA. Here's the DNA. The DNA was extracted from under the fingernails of the victim. He evidently had reached out and scratched somebody, And it mentions circumstantially that the trooper did have a scratch over his eyebrow the next morning, but that's just circumstantial. There are two contributors to the DNA. I'll show you some data. One was 93.3%. The victim's DNA alleles are just towering over anything else that's going on. They're sort of at the bottom is 6.7% of some unknown second contributor. It was adequate DNA, about a nanogram of DNA, 1,000 kilograms. STR analysis was done by the FBI lab with Profiler Plus and Profiler. We know the victim's contributor genotype. We have it and we see him in the data. We were asked by the prosecutor to do true allele computer interpretation using quantitative methods, looking at the p-kites. And from that we inferred the unknown contributor genotype, which, as you've just heard, just like inclusion, is a probability distribution. It just places different weights on what it sees based on the evidence using its own likelihood. Only after having inferred the unknown was any comparison made with the suspect genotype. Next slide. 3 match statistics were inferred. The inclusion method gave a score of 13,000. Dr. Robin Cotton was brought in, kind of like as an arbiter, because we had 2 scores, to give a score using an obligate allele method, which I'll refer to as subtraction. That gave a score of 23 million. And the computer, true allele, gave a score of 189 billion. And so the first questions that you can ask is, why am I looking at 3 different match scores? In fact, you can even ask more fundamentally, what the heck is DNA interpretation if you get scores ranging from thousands to billions? What's going on? How do these interpretations methods differ? And what should we present in court? So let me answer that. So what's the difference? Well, the only real difference between inclusion, obligate allele, and quantitative review is the data that's used. And this is something we showed to the jury. This is one of these things where I came in with 50 slides. I felt like an Alice's restaurant with all the circles and arrows in the back of every colored glossy photograph, and he chose 4 pictures, So this was one of the 4 things that got shown, because it made a lot of sense to the jury. There's a victim profile, there's quantitative data. Inclusion does not use the victim profile, nor does it use the quantitative data. It uses an all or none method. Every pair has equal share. The obligate allele method does use the victim profile, but does not use quantitative data, and a quantitative method, in this case, uses both. Next. So there was a Fry hearing, as you might imagine, since this, as far as I know, was the first time somebody was presenting this sort of quantitative computer modeling result. And we went through, and I asked Kathy, just so you could see what we did. We've updated it since then. But this is what we actually showed at the Fry hearing. About 50 references. I'm not going to, if you ask, I'll go through whatever you want. It can take hours. And you miss your flights and you blame me. And we also gave them a CD that had every article on it, so they could go off and Larry Mueller could mull over whatever he saw and enjoy it and have fun. So in overview, what we saw was there's a long literature on quantitative STR peak information and how it's used. People have known in many fields that it's roughly linear, proportional. The more that comes in, the more that comes out in proportion. Genotype probability distributions have been around a long time. I think Mendel wrote the first paper on it back in the last century.
Mendel didn't have genotype at that time.
Yeah, we can discuss it afterwards.
Yeah.
I didn't put it in.
Just
but
for the younger ones.
A Punnett square is implicitly giving a probability distribution of a genotype. That's what it is.
We can talk about that later on.
Okay. Computers have been interpreting STR data almost from the very beginning. We give a bunch of articles, both for how that's done. For statistical modeling and computation, this is a fascinating story that I won't go into. I guess it started during the bomb project and has a fantastic history. You can read about it, or you can ask me about it afterwards. I won't tell you about it. But basically, in the last 20 years, the concept that you can build hierarchical models, not just work with bell curves and large numbers, but build models with thousands of variables and use them to solve problems using statistical search, Markov chain Monte Carlo methods, has become the norm in science. You can solve very complicated problems by modeling them and computing them in ways that people were not doing 20, 30 years ago. They are now. It's the standard. There's a large likelihood ratio literature starting off in the 1950s with Jack Good's book, Savage's book, and it's building on that of the notion of how you would compare two hypotheses in a way that expresses the sensitivity and specificity in one number and can be combined by independent experiments either simultaneously or sequentially. Mixture interpretation, there was an interesting ruling 2 years ago now in DC, the Roberts case, which indicated, and the judge found this helpful as well, that while the data can be debated, mixture interpretation in that court's view was always admissible because the expert could be brought in subjected to cross-examination and the defense could bring their own experts in. So in some sense, in theory, you don't even need to do a validation study. We're not such cowboys. We like validation. Then there are a number of systems for quantitative DNA mixture deconvolution. The most interesting one at trial, or the hearing actually, was Jim Curran's paper from New Zealand. They actually wrote a program and published with very similar mathematics how to do two-person mixture methods, inferring genotype probability distributions, using hierarchical Bayesian modeling of mixture weight and genotypes, using Markov chain Monte Carlo. That was very impressive. It was just published, and that's what maybe 3 or 4 groups around the world do research on. It gives, and as he found, got a lot more information. You'll find a description of how much more information in the matched likelihood ratio paper that I gave you, where I describe not our results, but Jim Curran's results, and how you can understand what he did. And then we showed our own publications. And the judge found that helpful in his report, and we went on to trial. Next slide. Something else, though, Mark. Okay, I'll go faster. Yes. No, I'm almost done. Yeah. You have this paper. This is the DNA information gap paper. What this slide says is that on a controlled laboratory study of mixtures and dilutions, each point represents one experiment where we happen to know the amount of DNA, and we measure, after we infer the genotype, how much information we got. Here's a scatter plot. What do we see? We see exactly what you would expect. Human review goes down to about 100 picograms of DNA on a large log scale, and then people aren't comfortable below that. The computer continues down to about 15 picograms. Doesn't have much of an issue with that. And then we could use this study, which is published in PLOS ONE, as a calibration curve and say with a 6.7% mixture, 1,000 picograms, how much information would we expect? Well, for 15 loci used, a quadrillion to 1, with 12 loci, trillion to 1. That's what we saw. So the defense's contention that we should have seen what the FBI saw simply wasn't supported by the data. Next slide. And basically, I testified the usual thing, like in the European report about mixtures, that we just used more of the data. Adele said the same thing. The best metaphor was the notion of a magnifying glass and a microscope. The naked eye was one method, magnifying glass the next. The microscope was the most powerful. Same data, same slide, but better resolving instruments on the same data. Next slide. I told a whole story about pneumonia, and but I won't go into it. Let's use that microscope for 3 minutes and just see what stuff looks like. These are all shots from Trulio. And we present everything visually so people can understand it. 3 years ago it was all numbers. We didn't even know what was going on. Now it's all pictures and numbers. This is the mixture distribution on the scale of 0 to 100%. We see it's 6.7% with some probability distribution. Next slide. This is what, as you have read about, what a DNA profile looks like. At every locus, there's a probability distribution. Out of the hundreds of possibilities, sometimes there's one possibility, other times there might be 2 or 3 or 4, and they have some probability associated with it. You can show the same picture with CPI, And you see a lot of things that are lower and more equal. Next slide. This is what the log likelihood ratio looks like. This is 10, this is 100 on a log scale. At every locus, if it were a mismatch, you'd see everything in red pointing to the left with a number of around -20 sitting there. Next slide. This is what data look like. Here we see the victim, 12, 14, some low-level peaks. The 15 is not in a stutter position, so it's probably going to be there. Next slide. And this is an explain interface where you can do a what-if analysis quantitatively as a user to ask why the computer did what it did. In the case that will end up matching of 12, 15, the blue is the 6% of the unknown. That's the victim. And when it generates the pattern accounting for stutter, prep amp, and everything else, you see that the pattern in gray matches the data in green. Now, it's not the only thing that matches. If you were to put both bets as a 15-15 homozygote, you get some comparison, but almost nothing else really works very well. Next slide. As we see, when we go to the report interface, and in dark blue, quantitatively, that 12-15 shows that a better fit's more likely it. 90% of the likelihood goes there, a little bit to the homozygote. Human review, with inclusion, though, places its bets equally across all 6 allele pairs for those 3 alleles, including the 3 where there's not even what would be the obligate allele of 15. So this is, again, the only, we can run anything through the system, including human review, for comparison. This is the only difference. Quantitative, qualitative. Better fit, equal share. Next slide. This is what a report looks like. We hand these out as well. We have a short form and a long form. The short form is a trial. This is using, we can put in co-ancestry if people like that. It's very popular overseas for mixtures. This is the D8 that we've looked at. This is how you do a likelihood ratio. At 12-15, it gave it 90% probability. What you believed before was 3.6%, the population. The ratio of those two is 25, 90 divided by 3.6, and the log of that, base 10, is roughly 1.4. Add them all up, take 10 to the power, and you get 100 billion. And this is quite easy to explain. Well, next slide. We showed this at trial. The prosecutor wanted to show that it wasn't magic. He was very comfortable showing multiple results from different experts. Each expert explained how they did it, and it was explained why the methods were different. So in orange, actually, what is it? Inclusion is purple. You see, you get a little bit of information here. When 10 to the 4th. When Robin Cotton did an obligate allele method, her 4 allele cases where a unique result is pulled out as the minor contributor at 2 loci, B7 and THO1, gave a tremendous amount of information. And it went up 3 orders of magnitude to 10 to the 7th. Quantitative review with true allele got those, and as we saw with D8, added a little bit more by more quantitative considerations. And so, actually, by showing the progression, then for another 4 orders of magnitude, 10 to the 11th of 100 billion, it was clear to the jury that it was really, this wasn't magic. There was a progression. If you used more of the data, you got more information. Next slide. Okay, so what did we learn from the case? It was an objective review. I'll be done in 5 minutes. Shoot me in 5 minutes.
You said 3 minutes last time.
Yeah, that was an estimate. That was manual. This is by computer.
Okay. We've got to get moving, Bob.
I'll take this.
Yeah, okay.
It was an objective review that never saw the suspect. We found it straightforward to testify at court. It was understandable to the triers of fact. Before it didn't, but now it has precedent. It's been admitted, testified to, accepted, and so on. The key idea was to preserve match information that's present in the data. That's been the theme of our research for the last 20 years and the papers that we write and what we do. The attorney liked the fact that we got the data on a Friday and he got his answer back on a Monday, which computers can do despite how complex the case was. And the main lesson we learned was that it was quite easy to present multiple match scores in court and explain them, different experts. And nothing was withheld from the jury. And this is part of the way forward with New York State. As we do parallel work, continuing with the old method and then adding the new method, and just being able to explain why a closer look gives you more information. Next slide. Kevin Foley was convicted. You can read about it. You have this in your binder. This is about the only readable thing in the binder that has no math in it, which describes the case. Some of you have read it. It has no math in it, and basically it all hung on the DNA. Next slide. This is what you see. This is a 3 unknown case, which you have in your binder, which was resolved into 3 genotypes. Next slide. This is what the genotypes look like. The 60% genotype gave 10 to the 17th, the 25 gave 10 to the 11th, and the 15% gave 10 to the 11th. You see that as there's less DNA, you go from more certainty at each locus to a more diffuse probability distribution. Okay. Next slide. Overall, over the 88 cases in duplicate, we see that the median efficacy is about 10 to the 15th, with about 3 cases that were under 10 to the 5th. Next slide. And this is the last slide. I actually was wrong again. I did that in 2 minutes. Productivity. What do we observe in the end? Well, this is the case classification Jane will go into. For the 35 simple cases, the average was 10 to the 16th, with a standard deviation of 0.1 information unit. And of those, human review could produce a max score in half the cases, and couldn't in the other half. For the 20 intermediate cases, the score went down a little to 10 to the 13th, 10 trillion, increase in the standard deviation, and human review could assign a max score to 25%, 1/4 of the cases, and couldn't in 3/4. And then for the complex cases that made up over 1/3 the study, which Jamie will tell you about, the average result was about 1 trillion, with a half log unit standard deviation, and of those, human review could produce a max score in 1/5 the cases and couldn't in 4/5. Overall, human review could produce a max score in 1 out of 3 cases, which in lab protocols and good labs mean you keep going. So on average, if you have mixtures and low-level interesting evidence, you have to do 3 tries with 3 reviews, and it takes a lot of effort, time, reagents, and people resources to look at 3 items to get 1 reportable score of about 1,000,000 to 1. The computer on the first try, over 96% of the time, is giving a result on average of over 1 trillion to 1, which is reducing the time it takes in a very objective process with fewer reagents, fewer resources, and so on, which might enable labs to do a lot more with less. Can I stop there, Jack? Is that okay?
Yes, you can, Mark. Thank you very much for that very thorough explanation of the quantitative approach you're taking. Does the committee have any questions of Dr. Perlin before we move on to Jamie Belrose?
Just a minor one, but I would like that to be addressed. Yes, you made a very eloquent speech for the obvious that more information, the better is the result. But I think information should be qualified. With more valid information, the result will be better.
I agree.
There are more than, at least in literature, there are more than one such method published. Have you compared yours with the others? You mentioned Currents, but there's one software called, one algorithm called LSD. For the law enforcement folks, LSD here is not the contraband substance, least square deviation.
Can I answer the question?
Yeah, sure. I haven't asked the question as yet.
Oh, okay, but I can answer, I can tell you about that.
There's a method that has assumptions somewhat different from yours.
Yes, it does.
Have you compared your result with theirs?
We know their results, we know their methods. Their methods are derived from our 2001 paper of linear mixture analysis. Mm-hmm. And when people were starting on this, including us in the FSS 10 years ago, the first results were looking at a joint calculation across all the loci simultaneously. From the same math, what the LSD group, I think it was in Tennessee, elected to do was to decouple each of these and imagine that each of the mixture weights were independent. Now, actual human practice in a laboratory when you compute a mixture weight is you take a spreadsheet. We do this in our studies. In fact, it's described in our studies. And what you do is you compute a mixture weight based on the peak heights at every locus. And then you take an average and you get a standard deviation as well. What the computer can do, using the linear mixture analysis math in our 2001 JFS paper, which is what LSD uses, is it uses a little bit of algebra with matrices. You can do it without matrices, but does some algebra so that when you can't separate the alleles, it also solves the problem. Now, as time goes on, you get more experience with this, you see that the correct way of describing the problem scientifically is not that they're all together or not that they're all independent. The correct thing to do is, which Coran does, we do, and other groups do, is and usually this comes from model refinement, is you build a hierarchical Bayesian model where you say the reality is that there is a template. That template has some mixing proportion that's true in nature but unknown to us. Each mixture weight experiment that's done on it with an STR locus gives you a measurement on what that can be. And then in a hierarchical model, you have the template mixture weight, you have the locus mixture weight, which is conditioned on the template, as well as whatever the genotypes are, which you don't know, because you have to cycle through in your Markov chain and find out. And then by iterating and saying that, using the proper hierarchical Bayesian math, that each locus is conditioned on the template, and the template has as its likelihood function the different loci, then the correct math is to expand it. That's the right math. That's the one that Coran does, that's the one that we do, that's the statistically correct way of trying to understand what's happening with the unknown variable, the template. And it doesn't make any assumptions that it's all the same, which is what we were all doing 10 years ago, nor that they're all independent, which isn't true either, which is what LSD does. So the method, at one point, maybe they'll update it to what everybody else is doing now, and generally accepted practice. But once people figured out that the correct answer was a hierarchical Bayesian model, where you have both in there, and you treat it properly with statistical search, the issue goes away.
I understand your logic. I think for the benefit of the users, it would be nice for you to document that what is, on March 2nd, the LSD got its second patent. It is a public domain information now. There are 6 examples they give in the patent folder where they claim your inference is wrong, theirs is right. Well, so I think it would be nice to have a resolution.
To explain that, 10 years ago, instead of computing probability distributions, we were doing what everyone else was doing at the time, which we don't agree with at this point, which is to look for what we thought would be the one best answer. And that was perfectly fine for inferring mixture weights, but it wasn't fine for inferring the probability distribution of the genotype. So if they choose to ignore the last 10 years of research, I guess that's fine. But that comparison was actually done in our validation study, and you'll find that I think it's figure 12, where we do the comparison of what happens when you look at each locus and the average, and do a comparison back against the computer average.
Now, I'm not siding with anyone. All I'm saying is, there is this document in the literature, and you very aggressively discount that.
We explain it. We don't discount it.
Wait a minute, let me finish. I'm being constructive. I'm not really trashing anybody out. Mm-hmm. Since there is something else in the literature which sort of contains that such and such assumptions may not be correct, and here is their quote-unquote validation study showing there are 6 examples where true allele inference is at question.
Not this true allele, something from 10 years ago. So you're talking about 2 very different things.
I think I gave the document to George. I think you should look at it. It is a document that is published March 2nd, so you may not have a chance.
We know the paper.
It's not a paper, it's from their patent application.
The patent comes from the JFS paper. We know
This is the patent.
No, this is a patent 2, not 2006 patent, Mark.
They have there's a recent patent over here.
You should look at it, and I think that at least subcommittee should be convinced that their allegation is incorrect.
Okay, let me convince you right now. They're comparing against an old result, pre-version 1. This is version 25, which has been extensively validated. The statements that were made 10 years ago were based on the best knowledge 10 years ago, and the comparison they're making is to old work from 10 years ago. Had they made a comparison to the new work, that might be interesting, but you're making a comparison with something that's very old and isn't the current practice. The current literature, as it appears for the last published literature for the last year or two, does what we do, what everybody does, because that's the most sophisticated Bayesian model possible.
Can you, for those examples and information, if complete, can you give me your inference based on your new algorithm?
It's not new. It's old. It's published by Curran. If we had the original data files...
With your today's software, can you give me the result of their examples?
If we have the original data files, yes.
Yeah, I think we can try to get them available.
I'll go further. In the MLR paper that you have on the match likelihood ratio, we took their published result from one of the 6 cases because Jim Curran used their published result in order, from their quantitative data, in order to run his Markov chain. And then we use that result to show what the improvement would be over inclusion. So in essence, we've actually done this already on some of their data and published on it. And you have it in your binder. Because that is the hierarchical Bayesian modeling that Curran did on their data. And there's no issue. You could raise it as an issue, but there isn't one.
Okay, these technicals, I think, are totally useless for the rest of the audience. I would like to see more concrete document that their allegation made on March 2nd, 2010 is based on some older version of your routine, not applicable to the current one that you have validated.
So we'll provide you with what version they compared with to indicate, Barry, you okay with that? To indicate why it's different from what we're currently doing with hierarchical modeling, and it does not share the same limitations.
That would give me comfort.
Okay, so we'll prepare a page document and clarify
So maybe
that for
difficult
you.
to get them all of the data, right, for all of the cases.
Well, I don't think
Yes,
that all of the background data is explicated in the patent document. So Mark probably has to get more information in order to utilize his current version of the software.
But is it doable even? Is it doable for to do additional?
I have no idea.
It may not be, but
Yes.
but I like
Yes.
Ranajit's suggestion
Yes.
of differentiating and clarifying which versions we're
Yes.
talking
Right.
about.
Yeah.
That we can do
Okay.
rapidly,
Yes.
like next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Any other questions from the committee? I dare not ask. Any more questions?
I think
If
Jamie
not-
is about to fall asleep.
Yes. If not, I should like to say this is the first DNA subcommittee meeting that I have failed as a chair to finish in the allotted time.
It's entirely my fault.
So anyway, but notwithstanding that, it's very important. This is very important material. Thank you, Dr. Carlin.
Thank you.
So could Jamie Belrose from the Northeastern Forensic Science Institute give us some details of the validation studies?
I'll be really
Carry
quick,
that.
I promise, because you only know one.
Very simple. So I've been asked to come and tell you what we've been doing at the New York State Police. Dr. Dusman has hired me as a consultant to help with some of the legwork that's involved with the actual validation of the TrueAllele. So I'm going to show you some of the stuff that we've been doing real quick. So the New York State Police validation of TrueAllele, again, is a statistical tool for genotype inference and match that can help you with your casework mixture samples. Okay. So why? Why has the New York State even chosen to undertake this very, very large project of using this novel method? Well, due to ever increasing evidence submissions, as I'm sure most of you have, and a desire to diminish their turnaround time, they've implemented several measures of automation on the front end. So extraction, quantitation, that sort of thing. So it has increased their sample processing capabilities. However, it's generated a new bottleneck on the back end. They now have a very large bottleneck in data interpretation and peer review. So all of that new data that's being generated very rapidly by our automation measures is generated increased amounts of data to be reviewed, and from those data, reports need to be generated, and those reports reviewed, as you know, before they're released. So generated a really big bottleneck. So again, despite their increased sample automation, it's resulted in a limited increase in their throughput. So what they've decided to do is explore some expert data interpretation systems, such as TrueAllele, which is the one that I'm helping with. And as Dr. Perlin described, this particular software has been designed to assist the scientists in obtaining and interpreting all available data. So real quick outline of our validation. We started by selecting 41 previously adjudicated cases. All of these cases, we selected them so that they ranged in case type and degree of difficulty, which I'll get into in a little bit. So again, case types, we chose multiple victim homicides, physical assaults, and of course the majority of our cases were sexual assaults, as one would expect. Again, I said we also chose varying degrees of complexity. So cases that we deem to be fairly straightforward, then a little bit more challenging, and finally some real doozies.
How do you spell that? Doozies?
D-O-O. So to get started, we obtained the original data files that were generated by the New York State Police analysts. We sent those to Dr. Perlin and his team, and they ran it through TrueAllele. They generated a report and sent it to me. And in the meantime, I was able to obtain the reports that were generated by the New York State Police, and then I was able to make a comparison. So something else that we did, in addition to choosing varied case types as well as varied case complexity, we also kept track of the type of evidence items that we were using. We wanted to ensure that we were really challenging the system. So in total, we had 368 items of evidence involved in this particular study. And as you can see, we had a really large range. So 97 reference samples, of course, a majority of them being vaginal, anal, and penile. We had 39 semen stains, we had clothing and bedding, weapons, blood stains, so on and so forth. So to get started, the very first thing we did was go ahead and double check all of our single source profiles. We're not confident that this particular system could handle single source profiles. Of course, we're not going to continue on into mixtures. So out of our 368 items of evidence, we had 202 single source profiles. It was approximately 5,000 independent allele calls, all working accordingly. I found absolutely no issues, which is great news since the New York State Police has been using TrueAllele in their databank section since July of 2007, and to date they've processed over 100,000 samples with no issues. So again, the case classifications. I said that we chose different types, such as homicides, physical assaults, sexual assaults. We also chose cases based on degree of difficulty. Again, some that were fairly simple. Again, these assignments are kind of arbitrary. We just wanted to be able to show that we didn't give or challenge the system with all very simple cases. We wanted to show that we did give it a range of complexity. So we just arbitrarily assigned them. But a simple case, basic two-person mixture, maybe a vaginal swab, victim and a suspect. Moderate sample, maybe a little bit harder than that. Maybe both contributors to a particular mixture are unknown. And then for our complex cases, we had a lot of partial profiles, maybe 3, 4, 5 contributors, maybe a lacking reference samples, things of that nature. So here's really the meat of the validation. This is one particular case. This is one that we deemed to be simple. This is a sexual assault, and everything you see here, this is the whole case. There's only 2 reference samples and 1 item of evidence. So what I've done, I've generated large spreadsheets like this for every single case. For New York State, I have the allele calls that were made by the analyst here in purple, and then next to it for that exact same reference sample, I have the calls that were made by TrueAllele, and those are listed in red. And you can see that for the samples that are listed as single source, there's absolutely complete concordance between the allele calls made by the human method and those calls made by the computer-based method. For this one here, for the sperm fraction of the vaginal swab, the New York State Police here in purple, they have a 2-person mixture. It's the victim and a suspect. And TrueAllele was able to tease out 2 unique profiles from this particular mixture.
So the New York State might say something to the effect of the victim and the suspect cannot be excluded from this particular mixture. However, true allele can take it one step further, and they were able to tease out 2 individual profiles. And then the color coding here, the orange represents the victim's profile, the blue the suspect. And I'm just trying to show you where true allele is calling the matches back to the reference sample, how they correlate. So true allele was able to say that yes, the victim and the suspect are both completely present in this particular mixture. So this is a simple case, pretty straightforward. So let's move on to a moderate case. This particular case is also a sexual assault. There are 7 items of evidence. I've eliminated the reference samples and some of the other items just to try and make the slide a little bit easier to look at. But you can see that we have fingernail scrapings here and anal swabs, which can be a little bit more challenging to deal with. Again, note that your single source sample, complete concordance between the 2 different methods. These 2 samples over here, we have the non-sperm fraction of our anal swab and the sperm fraction of our vaginal swab. Again, true allele was able to tease out 2 unique individual profiles.
Can I ask you a question on D21 on the second column, single source?
Yes.
Why did you put those 30 and 32.2 in parentheses? Does
The
it
New York State Police does this when there's peak-height ratio differences.
Okay.
So again, true allele was able to tease out 2 unique profiles. In addition to doing that, true allele also tells you what it believes the mixing weights to be. So for this case, each of these is approximately a 90-10. So you might be asking yourself after hearing me tell you that true allele can tease out typically mixture profiles into unique profiles, how often can it do that? So of the 368 items of evidence that we had, 88 of them were mixture samples, and true allele was able to do this complete separation or complete deconvolution 40% of the time across varied mixing weights. So 50-50, 80-20, 90-10, it was able to do it at all of them about 40% of the time. You'll note over here on this first one I listed as a possible mixture. You can see there's an 18 here in green. The New York State Police would say this is a potential mixture. Now I haven't seen the EPG, but I would wager to guess that 18 may be elevated stutter. But you can see that true allele has only listed 1 individual's profile, and there's not a third allele here. So you might be asking yourself, why is that? So you can see that I've noted up here that true allele was asked to solve this particular item of evidence. It was asked to solve for 1 unknown. So it did that. However, if your analyst felt that this particular sample was in fact a true mixture sample, it could ask the computer to also solve for 2 unknowns. You could ask it to do this, one question and another question, or they could ask both of them to be done simultaneously, like Dr. Perlin said, it can solve different questions in parallel. And at the end, you would have the answers or the data for both of those questions, and then their analysts could then make their ultimate decision. You can see there's also a 25 here in front of the 26. So like Dr. Perlin said, this particular method is inherently unbiased because it has to solve all of these questions in a 2-step process. It's given the data, it has to infer the genotype, that's then set in stone, and then it is then given the ability to make a match back to any reference samples that were submitted. So it can increase objectivity in your lab. So finally, we have our last type of case, which is the complex case. This particular case is a homicide. There was 1 victim, multiple suspects, and 32 items of evidence, and I've only plucked out 1 here to show you. This particular case was rather challenging. It had hairs, swabs of steering wheels, paint chips, so some really good stuff. I've chosen this particular item of evidence because this is the calls from the New York State Police. This is a 3-person mixture, and it's a complete 3-person mixture. And what I mean by that is that every single loci, each individual's allelic pair or allele genotype of that particular locus is seen completely for all 3 individuals. So that's fairly rare. You can see that true allele has again teased out 3 profiles, but again note this time they're not unique profiles like we saw before. So for instance here at D21, in the second profile, you can note that there's 4 alleles and not 2, like you would expect for 1 individual. So it's a separate profile, but maybe not a unique profile. This just represents that there's some uncertainty in the data here at this particular location, and you can see that true allele has reflected it here in the strength of its statistic. In this particular first profile, which is our victim, you can see that your likelihood ratio is very, very high. True allele is very, very confident in this particular answer. There's not a lot of uncertainty around that data. For the second profile that is generated, there's a little more uncertainty, and you can see that the likelihood ratio drops considerably, letting you know that. So if you were to use true allele, you could use likelihood ratios. The New York State Police currently would either use CPD or CPI for this particular sample. Again, it would be the victim and two of the suspects cannot be excluded. And likelihood ratios would generate a stronger association. It can make all of these determinations unattended, like I said. You could ask these questions and walk away and come back. And in addition to that, the mixture guidelines from Swigdam were brought up today. If labs were to employ systems such as TrueAllele, it could help with mixture interpretation standardization, not only within a lab, but across many labs. So like I said, TrueAllele can also do mixing weights. There were 88 mixture samples in our study, and the mixing weight again is modeled for each individual sample with an associated probability distribution. And as the uncertainty of your data increases, your probability distribution increases. So it just becomes less certain. And the same is true with the statistical strength like we talked about with the complex case. As the interpretational difficulty increases, your statistical strength decreases. And this is true for both your human and your computer-based methods. But keep in mind that your computer-based method always preserves more identification information. The likelihood ratio, like Dr. Perlin talked about, is still always greater. In some conclusions, TrueAllele, again, is capable of unattended quality checks and data review. You can do all this and you can walk away, ask a question. Standardization of mixture interpretations within your lab. It's, again, a very unbiased approach to data interpretation because, as Mark talked about, it has to infer the genotype set in stone, and then and only then can it then compare to reference samples that are available. And if you have automation in your lab like New York State Police does, it can help increase your sample processing capabilities because it can help alleviate those bottlenecks on the back end. So New York State Police, by taking a look at TrueAllele and some others, they're looking to start with to assist their analysts with interpreting very difficult mixtures, 3, 4, 5 unknown individuals. They'd like to reduce their peer review backlog on the back end and thus increase their throughput. So just some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Dr. Brady Dusman and his team for allowing me to work with them, and Mark Perlin and his team for all their work. So if you have any questions, you can contact us.
Thank you. This is a reply to the question. I want to copy it at some point. Okay. Thank you. Does the committee have any questions on Jamie's presentation? Any questions or comment? No.
Just one. So, if I understand your procedure of validation correctly, the TrueAllele inference was done by Mark or by your group also?
It was done by Mark's group.
Okay, so New York lab analysts did not try TrueAllele on their own.
Yeah, when we were starting it, it was more like an evaluation. We wanted to make sure to eliminate any human error. So to make sure that everything was done completely correctly, we had the individuals at Cybergenetics run our original data files through their system and then compare them to those at New York State Police. And then if everything was kosher from there, they would continue on.
The reason that I asked the question is I wanted to find out whether the specification of the parameters to run Mark's algorithm are transparent enough at this stage for a user to use, or we need to have him over my shoulder all the time to run the routine.
Yeah, the software is very, very easy.
Okay.
Dr. Perlin, give us a response, an immediate response to your question.
Point of order.
Yes.
You're dealing with a very complex issue here that wasn't on the original agenda of this meeting, and I suggest we table any further discussion of that so that people can have an opportunity to prepare appropriately.
Correct. I completely agree.
That's a motion on the table.
This is a complex issue, and I'm making my comments off the hat because I had only chance of 72 hours to look at that. It needs considerably more research and understanding to have something tabled on this issue right now.
So can we, absolutely, I mean, that seems to be we need 4 people to vote on something
Right.
anyway. So is there anything we can tell the New York State Police, Dr. Perlin, etc., what they need to do then, what additional documents they would need, or do they need to give us another presentation, or do we want to just think about it ourselves, or do we need additional material or additional presentation? What do you think, just so we can help them, because we don't want to come to the next meeting and then the same thing happens, so do we need additional material?
Well, I suggest we ask them to submit appropriate documents and ask specific questions that can be distributed to us well in advance of the next meeting, and we'll have an appropriate opportunity to think about it and come and ask intelligent, informed questions.
Okay, so, George, any?
I don't have the I mean, I would favor having a little more time to look at this. And I would go along with Dr. Hirsch's suggestion that we table it until the next meeting.
Okay.
And perhaps the next meeting could be as near as 2 or 3 or 4 months from now. It doesn't have to wait till, 6 months, it seems to me.
Can I make a suggestion to be more
Yes.
constructive? Since there is some degree of urgency or need of these from the, in the state labs, could Barry and his associates come up with some sort of a plan as to this is what they plan to do to take the validation to a formal approval stage? If that material is available to us, some of us might comment, could they include such and such thing before it is tabled out, so that we have more time in hand to review the materials?
Right, so as Dr. Hirsch suggested, what I think what the committee is saying is to the New York State Police is to please could you provide the committee then, as soon as you can, details of your implementation plan and any further documentation you think is necessary based upon the discussions we've just had. We have a lot of material here, and obviously the committee hasn't had appropriate time to review all of the material in detail, and there's been a lot of information given this morning. So Barry, Dr. Dussman, is that clear? Is that clear, or do you require any further clarification from this end?
Go forward with this expeditiously. You would like from me an implementation plan, how we're implementing it in our laboratory and how we would have to apply it. Basically, is that what you mean by implementation plan going forward?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Timeline?
With the timeline. And then in terms of additional information, I believe that we did supply you some, but we know there is additional information that may be useful. Is there anything else you'd like to see in terms of the software or capabilities?
For example, Jamie's presentation, we don't have that here, right? We don't have Jamie's information, the casework summary, do we?
It's in the report.
It's in the report,
The
yes.
information is all in the report.
Yes,
Yeah, here's just a summary of what's in the report, basically.
yes.
So,
The information is present.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to help the people who have to do the work to know what they should do. I mean, we have to read the material, I know that, but whether there's anything else that we can get that would help that process along would also be helpful to the people that this affects.
would it be appropriate to ask for a dialogue that as you review the material, if you should come up with any concerns or questions, that you can maybe submit them in advance? Would that work, or is that kind of as you encounter things, that we could bring them to the next meeting? Or?
Mr. Chairman, it's their proposal. I suggest they ought to do that which is appropriate and necessary to get their point of view across. I move we table this and let's go on.
I want to see the transparency of understanding the parameters for the users. I don't want. I don't want to have true allele system approved without approving Mark Parlin's expertise in each casework. I want to see the transparency of understanding of the parameters for daily use. If I have to call him up every time, it is not yet validated for general use.
But surely scientists validate something. You validate. There's an appropriate way to validate something. You look at data and you validate that data.
Yeah, right.
And so the question is, do we have sufficient data? It's obvious that at this moment in time, this committee does not believe we have sufficient data in front of us at the moment to make a decision as to whether or not this has been appropriately validated for operational use yet. The question is, can we come to that? Will there be sufficient? Will there be a sufficient knowledge base at the next meeting that will enable us to make a decision one way or the other? So I suppose that's the question. So it's now incumbent upon the user, New York State Police, to provide the committee with any additional documentation that you feel necessary to help us understand that the validation process is taking place. In other words, here's a question, here's a validation, and this is why we believe this is a valid approach. So I think Jamie touched on certain parts of this. She just showed a couple of cases. It's only a small snapshot, and we haven't seen. I didn't see all the alleles. I haven't done that myself and looked at these myself.
Well, there is a time constraint.
Yes. So maybe that would be just to help you, something in much more detail as to the cases and how you've done it and what the results actually show in terms of summarising that data. You have it already somewhere. It's probably just we haven't fully seen it. Is that? Anyway, so the motion on the table is to table this discussion, the consideration of the true allele validation to the next meeting. Sure. So all those in favour, it's been seconded. All those in favour of doing that, say aye.
Yeah.
Aye. So we'll table it to the next meeting. Okay. Thank you very much. We have a few other items here. These are basically informational items for the committee. These are the review of internal DNA quality assurance audits. There's no necessity here for a vote because these are internal audits. They're not the accreditation audits. I understand that Nassau County is undergoing the accreditation audit. That's a separate issue at the moment. It's not on our agenda. So we have internal audits from the various labs. One is from Erie County, and I think we have representatives from most of the labs.
Nobody from Erie.
Nobody from Erie County.
They had no findings in their audit.
So Erie County, there's the committee, we've had the documents in front of us. Any comments regarding the internal audit of the Erie County lab? No? Then we have the Westchester County lab, internal audit. There was some question here regarding improper sealing of evidence or...
In fact, what happened was when
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Bharat Lakhar. I'm the Assistant Lab Director at Westchester County Forensic Lab. During the internal audit, what happened was when we went into the vault inside the fridge where some cuttings and some extracts were kept, a few of them were found to be unsealed. So our procedure is to raise a form which is called quality issue review form as soon as we find something, and then you, according to ISO 17025, you have to investigate and try to see what's the implication. I mean, is it something serious? What we found was these very few items, and in fact the whole sealing was completed within a period of about 15-20 minutes, so it was not really an issue where we had to take any corrective action. The way ISO 17025 addresses it is you just have to undertake correction, and it's a limited kind of correction. So really there was no corrective action taken, but only the situation was corrected.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any comments on that? from the committee? Any further comments? No. Thank you. We now have Onondaga County, the Onondaga County Lab.
There's no representative.
Yes. Any comments regarding the internal audit?
There was no issue.
It was something to do with training for automated extraction method, but
That was a new standard.
It was a new-
July
yes.
2009, so we just haven't had time to complete that.
okay. Then New York City OCME. Any comment on the OCME? I think they're probably just washing their hands more frequently after that. The Suffolk County Crime Lab.
That's with a better protocol, and I think they've met that.
Yes, there was some question about the adequacy of the interpretation guidelines, and in fact, Suffolk County have got a new set of interpretation guidelines.
Yeah, I left that out. That was inadvertently left out of the packet.
So any comment on Suffolk County? So these are just the internal audits, so we've duly noted the committee considered them and make no, and for information purposes, we've reviewed them and make no additional comments. So thank you. Lastly, we should talk about next meeting date and location. Typically it's 2 months or so, is that correct? Is there an issue with regard to the commission?
Not really, but if you want to meet in 2 months to consider these other issues, you can do that.
Yes, so there's no constraints with regard to the commission, so we can meet, so this is March, April, May, so 2 months would be May, 3 months would be June. Does the committee have any, I know we can't be very precise at this moment because of schedules, but in general, do you think 2 months would be okay, or is it?
Go for June.
June.
Certainly, I think we need to avoid July and August.
Yes.
Because there's going to be a lot of conflict. We ought to be able to find something in June.
So we try June then? We'll try June as a... So lastly, I'd like to just, on behalf of the committee, certainly, I would like to express my best wishes to the previous commissioner of DCGS, Denise O'Donnell, who was very supportive of this committee. And so she's now no longer with DCGS. We'd like to wish her the best of luck in what she's doing. So with that, I should like to adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.
You.